Greetings, it's great to have all of you here. Almost 9 months ago, an apologist by the name of Elijah Yossi made a series of live streams in response to our video about the Tome of Pope St. Leo. In a short period of time, he released 6 live streams in response to us, and they are broken into 2 themes. The first series is comprised of 4 videos and is what he believes some sort of rebuttal to our video on Papal Infallibility and the Tome of Pope St. Leo. The second series has 2 videos, and he films it with another apologist on a different topic. Now, the 4 videos in the series he did on Papal Infallibility did very poorly. 3,800 views for the top one and 1,500 for the second rank one, both of which are nearly 9 months old. Whether we respond to that second series depends largely upon how well this response video is received in terms of both gaining Patreon subscribers and collecting view count. Obviously, if we were to place a large amount of effort into making a video, yet it receives a small audience, and hardly anyone subs on Patreon for it, there's little reason to continue with a topic as opposed to moving on to bigger and better projects. Now, it should be noted that Elijah composed just over 8 hours of video to respond to our hour-and-a-half-long video. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that. Sometimes you need to unpack a topic, but he could have done it in far less time had he, 1, spoken at a normal pace, he speaks painfully slowly, and 2, had he written a script, which would have kept him on topic. The series is replete with chronic rambling, unacceptable amounts of repetition, and the ubiquitous need to announce what he will do later on. It appears he considers seemingly endless repetition as a substitute for sound arguments. Now, initially, I had thought that had he cut out the rabbit trailing, avoided undue repetition, and actually done what he said he was going to do instead of constantly telling people what he would do, that he could have cut the 8 hours down to 2, perhaps 2.5 hours. I was actually wrong, and I know because in preparation for this video, I recently watched a show Yossi did on Suan Sona's channel called Intellectual Conservatism, and you can see the slide on screen now. In that show, Yossi managed to give the entire presentation in about an hour and a half. Now, he left out several superfluous quotations which he had included in his series, but if you want to see his presentation in a crystallized, non-rambling form, we would advise you to check out that interview instead of Yossi's series, because Suan guides the interview, and in guiding it, he thereby keeps Elisha on topic by keeping him on a short leash. Now, while you're at it, there are 3 other videos you might want to see. Next slide, please. You can check out the debate we did with Suan on our channel, half of which is free on YouTube. The other half is available to Patreon subs. You can also watch the Seraphim Hamilton and Suan Sona debate on the same topic, also on our channel. On Suan's channel, there's an interview that he did with us in which we talked about the papacy. Now, one can read the entirety of the Relatio compared with the Council's suggestions and the copious footnotes from Father O'Connor, the priest and scholar who translated it, in about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Throw in the introduction and the 2 essays on Papal Infallibility at the very end, also by Father O'Connor, and you can still do it in less than 3 hours maximum, and that includes separate bathroom and snack breaks. If you compare that with the fact that Elijah created 8 hours, 1 minute, and 46 seconds of video in response to our hour-and-a-half-long video, it comes out to something like you can read the official interpretation of Papal Infallibility, as well as a fantastic commentary and essays by the expert who made what I believe is the only translation of it into English, in about 1/3 of the time it would take you to listen to Elijah's disjointed and exceptionally dull video explanation. And that is truly depressing. But if you do decide to put yourself through the boredom of listening to Mr. Yossi's series, come back to our video and comment stating what you thought of them. Now, one might very well ask themselves, why would you respond to a video that has not even been able to garner 4,000 views in 9 months? Why not just ignore it? Well, the reason is that when we first began this project, we at Ubi Petrus had initially disagreed on which videos to respond to, but we came to an agreement. We would only respond to those videos that have as many views as our least viewed video that has been out 1 month or longer. And as Elijah's 4 videos have finally attained that, I should say one of his videos has finally attained that, and it only took him 3/4 of a year to do it, we decided, being that he had put in 8 hours, 1 minute, and 46 seconds of rambling to respond to us, it would only be appropriate if we were to reply. The other reason is that our Essence Energy script is, unfortunately, delayed yet again, and we'll be ready for the video editing right about the time one of us is out of the country, so we won't be able to have that ready until mid-January. So in an attempt to keep our promise to our patrons by having a video out every month, we decided we would set everything else aside and make this video. We had attempted to avoid having to plug the time into doing a response video and simply save ourselves the time and effort by doing a debate instead, which still requires a substantial amount of preparation time, but far less than a documentary video. And so when Mr. Yassi posted his live streams, we offered him a debate. In fact, we've offered him a debate at least 4 times. He's declined all of them. One of those, we actually offered to debate him on Suan Sona's channel, with Suan being the moderator. Mr. Yassi, of course, declined. And he's given various reasons for his refusal, but the most entertaining one is this here. He states that if he were to debate us, his friends at R&T would not be friends with him anymore. Okay, so his friends are so possessive that they would not allow him the opportunity to humiliate those who have humiliated them, or at least tried to humiliate them. It sounds like he needs new friends. But this only makes sense if you understand that it's a complete cop-out. And then when you look at the next comment from another R&T staffer, the ever so loquacious and emotionally flamboyant William Albrecht, we see that William apparently does not have a problem with Elijah debating us. In fact, according to William, Elijah would have crushed us. But this then means that Michael Lofton and Eric Ibarra have Elijah on such a short leash that they won't allow him to publicly put Ubi on the spot and potentially humiliate me. Imagine what a boost that would be for them, but they will not allow it. But apparently, in the mind of the rest of the R&T staff, Yassi, making nearly 12 hours of disjointed live streams about Ubi Petrus, 8 of which are on Papal Infallibility, endlessly commenting after Ubi's comments under videos, arguing with Ubi in Facebook comment sections, and the rare occasion I'm on Facebook, and pointing out Ubi and posting about Ubi on Twitter, those don't cross a red line that supposedly crushing me in a debate would have crossed. And again, it only makes sense if you realize it's a cop-out. Now, you can see in the next slide here, while William was at it, he commented on the Isaiah 22 debate we had with Suan. And he reveals just how clueless he is when he's commenting on the debate Suan and I did on Isaiah 22. Now, notice that William is pointing out that the connection is undeniable, that Suan supposedly should have crushed me on it, etc. But I seeded the connection. In fact, I seeded the connection, and an entire 25-minute presentation was based on that connection existing. So William either didn't watch the debate, or is creating a straw man, or is just really challenged in the audio and reading comprehension departments. Further, Albrecht takes a swipe at Suan in regards to the debate. It's a cheap shot, but unlike William, I thought Suan did a Very fine job, did an excellent job presenting and defending his position. I point out that had we debated Yassi, it would have shined a spotlight on him and promoted him. And yes, it would have. But at least we would have been able to save a substantial amount of time in nipping this in the bud, and we would have also had something to put on Patreon. So it would have balanced out. On the other hand, Yassi has already been endorsed by several other Catholic and Protestant channels with far, far larger viewership than ours. And that has not helped his view counts. His videos that do not have our name in the title garner several hundred views in their first month. So at this point, we do not think that responding to him will do more than being endorsed by Reason Theology, Ibarra, Sona, Gospel Simplicity, being mentioned on Frad's channel, etc. Further, response videos are an entertaining way to present the material to an audience. You can couch a topic that you want to discuss in the form of a response video, and people tend to like it. Now, we thought it worthwhile to reapproach the topic of papal infallibility, as now, more than at any other time, we are being approached by those interested in the Church. And they focus on the fear of papal power, seeing now as Vatican I has, so to say, gone sideways with Francis. Of course, the existence of Pope Francis is not a viable reason to convert to Orthodoxy. The existence of Francis is not a direct proof against Catholicism per se. But the damage that Francis could, can, and is doing to the Catholic Church is a strong proof against the wisdom behind a set of dogmas that grants autocratic jurisdiction and fallible capabilities to a Marxist Jesuit. A side note, and we should say this because we get quite a few responses, questions about responses. Please do not ask us if we will respond to videos made in response to us until you yourself have actually watched them. The reason is, why should we make a response video to a video that you won't even watch? Further, if you want a response video and you want to ask about it, you want to know when we're doing one, when you watch it, collect a series of points that you think need to be addressed in their video with exact timestamps. As many of these points are already covered in our other videos, and a quick glance over the chapters in our videos can direct you to spots that will likely answer your questions. On top of it, as we grow in viewership, we are more and more likely to have numerous detractors, and being that responding to each of those videos takes an exceptionally large amount of time to create, it boils down to a simple math problem. There are simply not enough hours in a month for us to spend 75 to 150 hours per month simply making response videos when, to be frank, most of the videos have been made so far are so exceptionally lame and underwhelming that they are not even worth responding to. So in reality, unless a video strikes us as particularly worthwhile to respond to, we will simply direct you to other materials, whether scholarly literature, sections in our own videos and blog articles, or those of other creators, some of whom are actual scholars. We are not scholars, that should be pointed out. We're not experts. We don't claim to be. And through those, you might better understand the arguments at play. Also, the fact that there are far more Catholic apologists than there are of us. And so if they really wanted to, they could make a series of response videos completely flooding us, and it would stop us in our tracks for about 8 or 9 months while we tried to create a response to every single one of them. And considering that most of the material coming out of Catholic apologetics is just rehashing of the same old, boring arguments that they trot out again and again and again, when you answer one, you've answered most of them. They're cookie cutters of one another. So for that reason, 90% of the time, we're probably not going to respond to people who respond to us. We will, of course, offer them a debate, but if they decide not to debate us, well, the proof is in the pudding. Now, having said that, and prior to beginning, we want to thank you for listening. We also want to really thank our patrons who've made this possible. Without the support of our Patreon subscribers, videos like this are simply not possible whatsoever. They make it happen. So make sure to like, subscribe, and share, as we depend upon you for posting these videos on social media to spread the word. Furthermore, join us on Patreon if you haven't already. It helps us out tremendously. You can join for a month and watch all of our premium material for a flat fee. That money you send in allows us to purchase the necessary academic literature, technology, and software to research, write, narrate, and video edit these videos. It also cannot be said enough that these videos take an extraordinarily large amount of time to produce. We don't just head out to the back porch, crack open a beer, and write a script in a matter of hours. No. Each script takes somewhere between 75 to 150 hours to create. I will say that again. 75 to 150 hours to research, write, narrate, and video edit. That's 75 to 150 hours away from our spouses, away from our children, away from our work. It's time we could have been catching up on sleep, playing with our kids, spending time with our friends, supporting our spouses, eating dinner with our families, or just enjoying a relaxing evening. That also does not account for the outrageous price of academic literature, which we need to buy to research for these videos. It's common to pay $50, $60, $70, or even dollars or even more for a book that you will need to read in order to handle a relatively small question in a video. Case in point, combined, we've spent somewhere in the range of $1,200 on books to produce this up-and-coming series on the essence energies distinction. It's not including books we've already owned and used, but new purchases. Tried to price our Patreon services low enough that for an entire month, they're cheaper than a pack of cigarettes. In most parts of the US, they are cheaper than a pack of cigarettes. To sign up, you have full access to our Patreon, to our premium content on Patreon. You have the exclusive right to message us with questions whenever, as we only field questions from Patreon subscribers. Due to the influx of questions, we had to sort out who we would and wouldn't reply to, and ultimately we have to pay the most amount of attention to the people who take care of us, to the people who make this possible. Not only can you submit questions for to us over email, but you can also submit them to our monthly Q&A sessions. You can also participate in those. Sign up for a year, you get 16% off. The whole year of learning for less than dinner for two. And you have access to all of our research we have done and will do. So before we continue, head over to Patreon, sign up, and listen to the full version of this video over there. Now, at the outset, it should be stated that the term consent, and you'll see this in the slide on screen, in the relatio can refer to two things. One, it can refer to permission, specifically that of bishops. And when it states not by the consent of the church in the relatio, it is referring to that definition. It means consent, so not by the permission of the episcopate, right? Second meaning of consent is teaching or mind of the church. And when it refers to the Pope searching out the consent of the church, it is referring to that definition. That is why, on the one hand, the relatio can speak of the Pope needing to seek out the consent of the church, in many sources he sees fit, while simultaneously denying that he must seek the consent of the church. The term is being used in two different ways. In one case, it means the consent of the bishops. In the other sense, it means, I should say, in the first sense, it means the teachings of the church, the mind of the church. In the second sense, it refers to permission from the episcopacy. Now, furthermore, there are three levels to the Catholic Magisterium. Next slide, please. Okay, the Catholic Magisterium is broken into two groups. You have the extraordinary, and then you have the ordinary. And within the extraordinary, you have ex cathedra statements, you have ecumenical councils. Okay, within the ordinary magisterium, you have what's known as the ordinary and universal magisterium, which, to be quite frank, it seems like they invented it about 150 years ago, but they've projected it back into the past, or they've sort of read it back into the past. And then you have the ordinary magisterium. And the ordinary magisterium is just, the daily teaching offices of a bishop, homilies. It can be something as high as an encyclical. They're not, they don't require the same level of assent that something like the ordinary universal magisterium or an ecumenical council or an ex cathedra decree require. Now, the ordinary universal magisterium, the most famous examples of it are Humanae Vitae, and then Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, which later on Mr. Yassi mistakenly states that Ordinatio is an ex cathedra. He uses it repeatedly in his videos as an example of an ex cathedra. It's not. It's ordinary and universal magisterium. You can actually read more about the ordinary and universal magisterium in Lumen Gentium chapter 25. So anyway, now Elijah is responding to our video on the tome. And if you've not watched that, this video will not make as much sense as it should. In fact, all you really need to do is watch the first 35 minutes or so of that video to get an idea of what we're getting at. And our arguments in the video are this. Next slide, please. 1, that the Relatio of Bishop Gasser at Vatican I is the official explanation of Pastor Aeternus. It's the best source for undertaking it. This commences at minute 403 in the tome video. Okay. It should be noted, Yassi cedes this. He admits to it. 2, that the Pope does not require the permission of the bishops to speak ex cathedra. This is laid out from minute 814 to minute 1032 in the tome video. Yassi also concedes this point. Third point, the Pope is neither forced to ask the advice of the bishops nor forced to accept it when it is given. This is given in the same section as 2, but commences at minute 909. Yassi also concedes this point. The fourth point is that when an ex cathedra is given, no one can disobey it. That commences at minute mark 302. And if you noticed a pattern, this too, Yassi concedes. Now from there, our initial section on papal infallibility, we argue along these lines. Next slide, please. Because the Pope is bound only by his own conscience and not the consent of an outside body of individuals in declaring teachings ex cathedra, and because Catholics are bound by an ex cathedra definition, a rogue or unscrupulous Pope could bind the entire Church to heresy. After all, who can out-interpret a Pope? That was our key argument. And as you will find throughout the video, Yassi's entire argument is this. Yeah, Ubi is right. The Pope doesn't need the permission of the bishops to speak ex cathedra. Yeah, he's right. Technically, he doesn't need to consult the bishops. Yeah, he's right. Ex cathedra binds a church. But that's only part of the truth. The whole truth is that just won't happen. That the Pope not consulting the bishops and, doing something bad, that just won't happen. The full truth is, trust me, bro, it's not going to happen. Well, that's not a very satisfying answer. In fact, that's really just blind faith. And he tries to balance that out. And we'll get into that further and further in this video. Now, we're going to play a clip here of Mr. Yassi from his first video. Let's play that right now.
I don't know if Ubi Petrus has read Gasser. Maybe he's just read a work by an Eastern Orthodox apologist or whatever, a polemical work, and he's seen some quotes from Gasser and he's taken it. I don't know. Maybe he's read the whole thing more times than I have. I don't know. But anyway, he says, finally, and this is where will be quotes. Finally, we do not separate the Pope even minimally from the consent of the Church, as long as that consent is not laid down as a condition that is either antecedent or consequent. And so what Ubi is getting out of this is that that the Pope does not have a condition, does not have this juridical obligation to seek the consent of the Church. And he's right. But it doesn't give the full picture. It doesn't balance things out. The Pope does not have a juridical obligation to seek the consent of the Church by polling the bishops. He does not have a juridical obligation.
Okay, so we can see here that he admits we're right on the issue of the Pope not having a juridical requirement. He says it right out. He goes, and he's right, but it doesn't give the full picture, and it doesn't balance things out. The problem, though, is that he claims this is almost some sort of like defeating proof, but his solution to it is, well, Ubi's half-truth, right? The full truth is the Pope would never ever go against the bishops. Okay. Next clip, please.
This is what we talked about earlier. This is what the Relatio was saying. We do not exclude the cooperation of the Church. Why not? Why don't you exclude it? If the Pope is infallible, why does he need to go and see what the mind of the Church is? Why does he need that? He's infallible. Right? He can just fart. Hey, that's infallible. That's what it is. That's what you think it is, but that's not what it is, right? It doesn't come to him in a form of inspiration where it's like there's a question that arises in the Church, and all of a sudden, because there's a question, now the Pope he has the answer. He doesn't always have the answer. He doesn't always have the answer. And so when he doesn't have the answer, he has an obligation to go seek the answer. And where is the answer found? The answer is found in Scripture, in tradition, in the bishops, in history, in the fathers. He has to use all those means before he decrees. He has a moral obligation of looking at all those. Moral obligation, not a juridical one. Meaning that if he doesn't do that, it's possible that one day, I shouldn't say that it is possible. It's an absurd situation. But let's just, as an example, let's say one day there's a Pope who one day says, you know what, I'm going to decree something. I'm going to decree something. And I'm not going to ask the Church what it believes about it before I do. If that ever happens, what he's about to decree, if it's actually orthodox, he will be able to decree it. Because if it is actually orthodox, then it would have the consent of the Church behind it. It would. It would never be in opposition. The Pope will never decree something in complete opposition of the Church, because he is decreeing the mind of the Church. He is decreeing what the mind of the Church is. So if it doesn't have the consent of the Church behind it, if it doesn't have the mind of the Church behind it, then it's false, because the Church as a whole is infallible. And he receives this infallibility as an extension from the Church, and then he decrees it as infallible. Okay, so yes, it is technically possible for the Pope not to poll the bishops and still be infallible. It is possible. But if he doesn't poll the bishops and he decrees something that is infallible, then it would be in agreement with the bishops, because it is assumed to have the consent of the bishops behind it. Okay.
Okay, so Yossi here, he makes a series of statements that we're going to come back to. One of them is, he states the Pope has an obligation to seek the answer. Now, later on in a third video he did, not video number 3, but one entitled, If the Pope is Infallible, Why Do We Have Ecumenical Councils? He chides me about saying the Pope has a moral obligation to go seek the answers, and then rants for about an hour about it. But you see that Yossi, again, he concedes our point. There's not a judicial requirement. There's no requirement for the Pope to seek the permission of the bishops. And furthermore, the Pope doesn't have to poll the bishops in order to gain the consent of the church. The other thing is that Yassi claims that the Pope has to go to all of the sources. That is not true. He only needs to go to those that he considers pertinent. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, please, you can see here from the Gift of Infallibility, the official interpretation of Vatican I. It states these means are councils or the advice of the bishops, cardinals, theologians, etc. It doesn't say councils and, says councils or. Indeed, the means are diverse according to the diversity of situations. And so really the Pope simply needs to satisfy his own conscience. Next slide, please. See here, this is from Father O'Connor in the footnotes. He says, ultimately, for the Pope's conscience before God. So it says, however, the deputation was steadfast in refusing to set any conditions into the draft itself, stating that the moral obligation was, one, ultimately for the Pope's conscience before God. He only needs to satisfy his own conscience that he has looked at sufficient evidence. Now, anyone in their right mind will go and poll the bishops. Anyone in their right mind will consult with the best scholars there are. Anyone in their right mind will do as much reading as they can. But what happens when you get a pope who is not in his right mind? What happens when you get a pope who's unscrupulous, or when they decide to go rogue? What happens when you have a Marxist Jesuit? Well, all of a sudden, if he doesn't need the consent of the bishops, if he doesn't have to poll the bishops, this could really go sideways really, really quickly. Okay. Let's see. He also, in that same clip, he gives a circular argument. And he says, if this decree gets through, it's blessed. We know that it's true because it got through. And he elaborates on this throughout his videos, stating that, I or someone would talk him out of it if he was about to make an ex cathedra decree that was not actually in accordance with the church. All right, next slide, please. Thank you.
What does manifest consent mean? Manifest consent means that the Pope has to physically and literally actually poll the bishops and ask their belief and permission and agreement and all that stuff before he decrees. Manifest consent. It's not denying that the Pope is required to have a consent of the church. He does need consent. He does not need manifest consent. And I will qualify that. I will qualify that, and I will unpack what that means as we go through this.
Okay, so there again, he sees our point. Manifest consent refers to them expressing their opinions. So he doesn't need each bishop to say, yes, that is correct, in order for him to speak ex cathedra. Okay, now let's go to the next clip, please.
And so what he's saying, to summarize, is he doesn't need to go seek the consent from the bishops because, he can know what the consent of the church is by other means. He can know what the bishop's mind is by other means, right? And he lays down what those means are. And one thing to keep in mind is the church's consent here, like I said, doesn't mean permission, because if it meant permission, it would be ridiculous, because it would mean that the Pope would have to go seek permission to act from the sacred scripture, from the consent of antiquity. That means you would have to go lift up the fathers of the church from the dead and say, hey, do I have your permission to act? No, it doesn't mean permission. It means agreement. That means, does what I'm about to declare, does that agree with scripture? Does it agree with the fathers? Does it agree with the church theologians? Does it agree with the bishops? Does it agree with the whole church's mind before I declare it? What they were trying to define is when he actually speaks ex cathedra. When he actually speaks ex cathedra, what makes it infallible? It's God himself. The fact that God allowed it to happen, God allowed the Pope to speak that decree, that means it has the approval of God behind it, because we believe if it doesn't have the approval of God behind it, the Pope would be impeded. And so what they're trying to say is, we're not here dealing with the private mind of the Pope in his private matters, because seeking the consent of the church from the bishops, that deals with the private matters of the Pope. That deals with his conscience, right? That deals with his conscience. And so it doesn't fall under the official declaration of ex cathedra, which is what they were dealing with. That's the question they were answering and nothing else. So that's reason number 2, why the Pope is not required to seek the consent. And if you want to look at other, I go through other reasons in the first part, but those are the 2 main reasons that Gasser gives. And the third one is because he may already know what they believe, right here, like in JP2, and when he decreed on women ordination, saying the church cannot decree on this. I mean, it cannot ordain women. He did not seek the consent from the bishops because the answer was obvious. The church has never, ever ordained a female priestess, I guess. No such thing, right?
So Yassi admits the Pope's conscience requires him to poll the bishops, and he discusses ordinatio sacerdotales. The problem, though, is, as stated earlier, ordinatio is not ex cathedra, and yet he's bringing it up as an example of how an ex cathedra works. Next slide, please. Now, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith has released several documents stating exactly what ordinatio is and stating that it is not ex cathedra. On the screen, you can see one of them here. Next slide, please. So it states straight out that it's by the ordinary and universal magisterium. Next slide, please. You can see again, in response to certain doubts regarding the definitive character of the doctrine of ordinatio sacerdotales from the Vatican website. Next slide, please. It states right out, universal and ordinary teaching of bishops dispersed throughout the world when they pronounce in communion among themselves and with the Pope the Catholic doctrine to be held definitively. John Paul II referred to this infallibility in ordinatio sacerdotales. Later on, it states it's ordinary and universal magisterium, not ex cathedra. Next slide, please. We have another document here, also from the Vatican website, concerning the reply of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on the teaching contained in the Apostolic Letter Ordinatio Sacerdotales. Next slide, please. States it again. It has been set forth infallibly by the ordinary universal magisterium, an act of the ordinary papal magisterium, in itself not infallible. So it's not an ex cathedra, and he brings it up throughout his videos. He tries to use it as an example of how an ex cathedra is supposed to take place. But there are examples of the ordinary and universal magisterium not being infallible. One such example that I was reading about was the topic of ensoulment. In the Catechism from Trent, it states that ensoulment occurred after conception, whereas modern Catholic teaching is that ensoulment takes place at the moment of conception. So you have a contradiction there. Now, of course, a lot of that gets into the fact that within the Catholic Church, there's oftentimes very little clarity on which documents fit into which categories. And then the Cedes, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, the CDF, has to come out and clarify and re-clarify and re-clarify. But Humane Vitae and Ordinatio Sacerdotales are two, probably the most famous examples of the ordinary and universal magisterium in the modern times. Right. Next clip, please.
Okay. So yes, it is technically possible for the Pope not to poll the bishops and still be infallible. It is possible. But if he doesn't poll the bishops and he decrees something that is infallible, then it would be in agreement with the bishops because it assumed to have the consent of the bishops behind it. Okay.
So again, he's admitting that the Pope doesn't technically have to pull the bishops in order to be infallible. He might just, shot in the dark, and he's right about it. Okay. Now, the other topic that Yassi got on us about was, can the Pope bind the church without consent? And there's a series of these somewhat humorous clips. Let's play clip 16.
Basically, his thesis is that Vatican I taught officially, and in the interpretation of Vatican I and Pastor Aeternus, that the Pope does not need to seek the consent of the church before he defines. And when he defines, if it's in opposition to the rest of the church, everyone has to just bow down to him. Now, that's an impossible situation from the Catholic perspective.
So again, you can see the answer is, well, that's just not going to happen. This is the only point at which he actually encounters our argument, and his answer is, well, it's just not going to happen. Okay, later on, and I want to say, let's play clip 18.
Vatican I's dogmatic constitution, Pastor Aeternus, stating that the Roman Catholic Pope can, at his pleasure, bind the Church to dogmatic decrees without the consent of the worldwide episcopate. But the Pope, we are told by Catholic apologists.
So did you hear that? The Pope can bind the Church. The Pope can bind the Church without the consent of the episcopate. That's what he says, right? Is that really what Vatican I taught? Was that really the mind of the Vatican I fathers? That's the mind of, would be Petrus. That's the mind of, Eastern Orthodox fellows out there. That's the mind of some Protestants. That's the mind of some Oriental Orthodox. But that doesn't matter. What matters is, what was the mind of the Council Fathers at Vatican I? What was the mind? What did they have in mind? As far as this question of seeking out the consent of the church, does he have the obligation to or not? We'll get into that. We're going to talk about that.
Okay, so you notice this. He says, so did you hear that? The Pope can bind the church. The Pope can bind the church without the consent of the episcopate. That's what he says, right? Is that really what Vatican I taught? Okay, here's the problem that Yossi brings up, or the problem what Yossi states. Consent of the episcopate refers to permission of the episcopate. Consent of the church can refer to mind of the church. And perhaps he's confused. He's accidentally said consent of the episcopate. But you see that he's contradicting himself from what he earlier said about the Pope not needing the permission from the bishops. All of a sudden he's mocking the idea that the Pope wouldn't need that. Let's see. Let's go to the next clip, please.
So today,
this one he contradicts himself.
The Catholic Church gets together in an ecumenical council. It's not like the Pope comes and says, here's how it's going to work, guys, and everyone's going to listen to me right now. Here's the teaching, and everyone is just going to accept it. Now, that definitely has happened before with Pope Leo and his tome. He just hammers it down. You accept it. You're Catholic. If you don't, you're schismatic, and you need to leave the church. Basically, was a stance. Mm-hmm. But it typically doesn't work that way. In an ecumenical council, right, it's bishops getting together and discussing matters and agreeing on dogma, and the Pope consenting to it. That's the way it's supposed to work. And I just wanted to take this time to clarify something, because a lot of folks, think that I've been saying that the Pope can't act alone, right? Can the Pope act alone? And people, I've literally said, like, so many times on the shows that I've done, that mm-hmm. Yes, the Pope can, C-A-N, act alone, right? He can't on a juridical level. Like, he has that power to do that, right? Right. But if you've been watching my shows, my series on the Relatio, what I've been trying to say is it's not supposed to work that way. That's not how Vatican I saw it working. That's not how Gasser saw it working. It's supposed to be the Pope is supposed to act with his brother bishops. That's how it's supposed to work. And providentially, that's how it will always work. Providentially.
Right, yeah.
Juridically, he has that power to act alone. So, and even with the recent, what is it called on the Latin Mass, Pope Francis,
Motu
proprio, even the recent one, folks are like, oh, there you go. He did this all on his own. He acted alone. Well, if you read the Motu proprio itself, he says that he consulted the bishops, right? He consulted the bishops. We don't know to what extent he did. We don't have the results. We don't have the polls or how he did. But you can see how he's mentioning that for a reason, because that's how it's supposed to work. The Pope is supposed to consult the bishops, talk to the bishops before he acts, right? So just to clarify to everyone, yes, the Pope can't act alone, but that's not how it's supposed to work. And if he does act alone, if there's a case where he neglects the whole church, he separates himself from the church, and he acts alone, he is committing a grave sin by doing that. That's how serious it is. Even though juridically he has that power, because Vatican I did not take away, did not say you have to poll the bishops. It says, that's just the way it's supposed to work, relatively speaking. But it's not an absolute way of the way it's supposed to work. And if you don't think that, if you think I'm changing my stance, go back and watch my shows. I've said it multiple times. I can even give people timestamps when I said yes, the Pope can't act alone, and then I go clarify that and qualify that. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Let's replay clip 18.
Vatican I's dogmatic constitution, Pastor Aeternus, stating that the Roman Catholic Pope can, at his pleasure, bind the Church to dogmatic decrees without the consent of the worldwide episcopate. But the Pope, we are told by Catholic apologists.
So did you hear that? The Pope can bind the Church. The Pope can bind the Church without the consent of the episcopate. That's what he says, right? Is that really what Vatican I taught? Was that really the mind of the Vatican I fathers? That's the mind of Ubi Petrus. That's the mind of, Eastern Orthodox fellows out there. That's the mind of some Protestants. That's the mind of some Oriental Orthodox. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what was the mind of the Council Fathers at Vatican I. What was the mind? What did they have in mind? As far as this question of seeking out the consent of the Church, does he have the obligation to or not? We'll get into that. We're going to talk about that.
So the listener can hear for themselves that he's contradicted himself, or at least it appears so. Now, again, perhaps he was confused in his terminology, but he says, without the consent of the episcopate. But then in this other clip with Mr. James Dofinger, who seems like a very nice person, Yossi states outright that no, the Pope, he can do that. And if anyone doubts it, go back to my video. Now, within his video series, even within that, he contradicts himself. For example, at that one spot we just played, he states, no, the Pope cannot do that. At other spots, he goes, no, yes, of course he can. Of course he can. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. This is from Father O'Connor's commentary on the gift of infallibility. You can see he states, the Pope individually is able to act for the entire college of bishops in such an act and do so without previous consultation or subsequent approbation. Okay, this is the scholar, the pre-scholar, whose work received in imprimatur and nihil obstat. He just states it outright. Now, what Yossi leaves out and what he admits later is that the bishops who agree with the Pope then constitute the true church. So if you have 10% of bishops agreeing with the Pope, that 10% plus the Pope are now the church. And what this inadvertently reduces the church to is the Pope for all practical purposes. They would deny this vehemently, but this is the logical conclusion. Now, further, Yossi admits later on that the Pope does not even need the majority of bishops to make a ruling, and he cites his reason as the church might be split on an issue. in which case no majority could be obtained. Now, it never occurs to him that perhaps time will solve the issue, which is what happened in a variety of cases in the church, that it was not decrees, it was just sort of time healed the issue. That's not to say we don't need decrees, it just states that, sometimes it's better not to decree and just to let things sort of smooth themselves over. Next slide, please. Now we have Gasser here. He states right out, we do not exclude this cooperation and this consent of the church. He means, yeah, if the bishops cooperate, that's great. And if they don't, we have chairman of the board who can just make a decision. Let's play clip number 21, please.
So he's just giving the definition of papal infallibility. So I'm gonna be allowing Ubi Petrus to do a lot of my work here, because the very beginning of the video, it's actually a nice introduction into papal infallibility, and it's a nice introduction into the importance of the relatio of Bishop Gasser, how important it is. He did my dirty work there for me. Excuse me. And so the thing that he highlighted here, and this is the most, in my opinion, the most misunderstood sentence in the history of ecumenical councils in the Catholic Church. Okay, this is the most misunderstood one, and therefore that the definitions of the same Roman pontiff are irreformable of themselves and not from the consent of the church. And this is what people are getting out of this, like Ubi Petrus. And you'll see that. What they're getting out of this is that the Pope can speak ex cathedra without having the consent of the church behind him, and he'll be infallible, and everyone just has to bow down to him and say amen and kiss his feet, right? Again, there is truth to that, not the kissing his feet or bowing down to him, but there's truth to that, but it's not the full truth. It's missing a lot of context. And once you put that in context, you'll be like, oh, I didn't realize papal infallibility wasn't that bad, right? I thought it was something else, and I'm speaking as the way you're going to be thinking as I go through this. And you'll see that it's a very, 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 very balanced teaching. It's a very balanced teaching, okay?
So he again admits we are right about the Pope being able to decree without permission, in this case phrased as consent of the church. Kissing the papal foot, though, was the standard way of greeting the Pope, so he's wrong on denying that. The full context is Yassi's talking about what the Pope supposedly wouldn't do, and that it would be sinful, but that wouldn't invalidate his ex cathedra decree. So it goes back to that point you made earlier. Yeah, Ubi is right, but that's not the whole truth. The whole truth is the Pope would never do these bad things. This would never, ever be abused. This would not possibly ever go sideways. But if it did seem to go sideways, it's because God approved of it. That's his, quote, full truth. Now, if you have the time to take if you take the time to watch all 8 hours of his video, you will notice that Yassi focuses on how it is, quote, supposed to work. In an earlier clip, he just says this repeatedly. It's supposed to work this way. He's not supposed to do it without this. It's supposed to do this. Okay, the problem is how it is supposed to work is not a mechanism of enforcement or a system of checks and balances. Case in point, priests are not supposed to molest young boys. Bishops and popes are not supposed to be complicit in a major sex abuse cover-up. The church is not supposed to be paying out billions of dollars gathered through tithes and sales of properties in order to pay off victims of their sexual abuse cover-up. So again, how it is supposed to work is not a means of enforcement. What we specifically indicated in our video is that there is no means of enforcement for an ex cathedra. So Mr. Yassi leaves this point untouched whenever he whenever he talks about how papal infallibility is, quote, supposed to work. For the next clip, number 22, please.
What Ubi Petrus does in his video that we played in the first episode, and we're going to play a little bit of it here in this third episode. What he does is he builds up this idea that papal infallibility is about the Pope standing up in front of the whole church and without consultation, without anything, decreeing something, and everyone just says, yes, amen, we believe and confess. And he leaves it there, right? I mean, there is a little bit of truth to that, but if you don't get the full context of that, you're not going to understand what papal infallibility is. And if you want to understand what it is, you got to go watch the first 2 episodes.
Okay, so again, we see another example of that. Throughout his videos, he admits what Ubi is saying is the truth, but he'll claim it's a half-truth. So Ubi's half-truth is, quote, the Pope can bind the entire church without the permission of the bishops. While Yassi's full truth is, Ubi is right, but trust me, bro, that just won't happen. Just won't happen, bro. I don't think that's a solid argument. Maybe the viewership does. I highly doubt it, though. Clip number 23, please.
Of course, this then begs the question of what, quote, not from the consent of the church, end quote, means if one can simply ignore pronouncements from the Pope when he intends to bind. It also begs the question of what exactly is the point of a Pope who can speak infallibly and without the consent of the church, if even a layman can out-interpret the Pope in matters of faith and morals.
A layman can out-interpret the Pope. What is he talking about? I don't understand this, because we believe that when the Pope decrees something ex cathedra, that's it. No layman, no bishop, no priest, nobody. Doesn't matter how many people you have that are against it. You can't say anything. That's it. That's it's decreed. It's done, and you'll see why. And you're not going to have a huge number of body of bishops being against it. That just goes against what we believe, and you'll see. And again, I'm speaking to Catholics. This is divine providence. This is a grace that God gives the church, where he leads the head and the body to the truth.
Okay, so he mistakes something when we said, what is the point of having an infallible Pope if even a layman can out-interpret the Pope? We are not stating that that is Catholic dogma. He's taking that out of context. What we're stating, we're making fun of that idea. And if you hang around trad circles, you'll notice that this idea that if a papal pronouncement is against previous magisterial documents, trads will say, well, we don't have to accept it. This is a standard speaking point amongst the rad trad group. This is one way that they're able to get around the anxiety of Pope Francis. They're afraid that he'll decree something ex cathedra and they'll just have to accept it. Okay, so that's not something that we're saying the Catholic Church accepts. No, we're making fun of those who state that, and Yassi did not pick up on that. The other thing is Yassi states a huge number of bishops will not be against the Pope, but then he contradicts himself. Let's play clip number 19.
That's where the headed members the whole thing of headed members works. Now, there could come a time where the Pope has two camps, right, that he's looking at. There's camp A and camp B, and he has to make a decision which one's the right camp. And he looks at both sides. And this has happened many times in history, even in the first millennium, right? We're going to look at a case today where that's happened. And he chooses which one is the Orthodox by looking at what the scriptures teach, by looking at what the fathers teach, by going into by holding a synod, a Roman synod, by anything that he can to get the right information about this teaching, and then he acts with that information, whether that information is scripture, with tradition, the bishops that he's meeting with, and also the bishops that are in contention with each other, because now he's looking at both sides. and he's acting with those bishops that he's agreeing with. He's not acting alone, right? And it's always important to know that the Pope does not isolate himself and decree something, right? He always decrees in uniformity with the bishops. You know, I'm not saying all the bishops or the majority. It doesn't have to be the majority, right? And so that's why the Vatican I did not want to include in the documents of decrees that the Pope has to go consult the bishops, because if that's the case,
all right, so you'll notice here he says the Pope does not even need a majority of bishops to agree with him. At the same time, he's saying the Pope will decree in uniformity, and it gets back to that idea that the Pope is the church, and those bishops who agree with him, even if it's 10% of the bishops, they now constitute the true church. Now, Yassi brings up the letter to the Swiss bishops, but the problem with the letter to the Swiss bishops is it is a promissory note that the Pope will consult with them, but it provides no mechanism for its enforcement. It also leaves the episcopate at the level of advice and consultation, as opposed to defining with him or requiring episcopal permission for an ex cathedra. So it says nothing against what we've stated. Now, Yassi goes back and forth on whether the Pope must poll the bishops. Okay, that's to be noted. If you can make it through the 8 hours, you'll hear this. Further, a document of higher authority than the letter to the Swiss bishops, that being the Relatio, states that polling the bishops is not necessary, and that the means of obtaining sufficient knowledge is variable depending on the situation. So, letter to the Swiss bishops, it's nice, but it pales in comparison to the level of authority the Relatio has, as far as I know. I mean, as far as I know, the letter to the Swiss bishops is not the official interpretation of Pastor Aeternus. And furthermore, this letter to the Swiss bishops, it's not a means of enforcement at all. But you'll notice between this last clip and the one previous to it, and the one previous, Yassi goes, a huge amount of bishops will not be against the Pope. And in this last one, he goes, oh, the Pope doesn't even need a majority of bishops to agree with him. So he's contradicted himself there again. Now, let's cue up clip number 24, and I will explain it. So what happens is that Yassi plays back part of an interview we did with Swan Sona, and in it, we say if the Pope if he can speak infallibly, why even have an ecumenical council? Why go through that trouble? Why doesn't the Pope just write some letters to some bishops, get advice that he needs, and then make an ex cathedra decree? In fact, this is the exact same thing that Yassi has been advocating for. The Pope does not have the answers, therefore he is morally obligated to go seek them out. That's what we're saying, okay? He takes issue with it, though. And this shows how all over the board he is. Play clip number 24, please.
Here we go.
Statement. The other thing is that, and I know this comes off as a trite argument, but we have ecumenical councils for a reason. If the Pope can simply speak infallibly, why doesn't he just send a letter out to some bishops who wants advice, looks at what they have to say, and then makes a decree on his own? I mean, really, if God is going to protect him from error, why doesn't he do that? Why go through the trouble of bringing all these bishops to Rome or to whichever council to pull them away from their flocks for months and years at a time, if all you have to do is just write a few letters, get some advice, and then make a decree? It's not a coincidence that the one council that came after Vatican I was a pastoral council. That's how we look at it. Now, I could be proven wrong. I mean, maybe Pope Francis will call a council and...
Okay. Can you all hear me still? Just want to make sure y'all can hear me before I answer this genius question here. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Thomas. So, and I'm sorry if that wasn't very clear. Basically, what he's saying, if the Pope is infallible, why do we need to? Why does the Catholic Church even have ecumenical councils? And if the Pope can just decree something, why waste time? Why waste time about bringing everyone together and holding councils? And he says, he can seek the advice of the bishops, but at the end of the day, he doesn't need to take that advice of the bishops. And we're speaking here in the context of ecumenical councils and papal infallibility, right? So
okay, so here I'm simply stating something he has repeatedly stated, that the Pope is morally obligated to seek out the mind of the Church via consultation. I state it in terms of the Pope writing letters to some bishops to find out the teaching of the Church. Elijah, and perhaps it appears if you watch all of this episode called If the Pope is Infallible, Why Do We Need Ecumenical Councils? It appears during that video that he's drinking, and that might be why he becomes confused, but he flips the situation around. And he accuses me of stating that people should write letters to the Pope to find out what is infallible, instead of what I actually stated, which is that the Pope writes letters to others seeking consultation. And in the short clip number 25, he rants on for a while, and then he gets to what is clip 25. And you can see where he's become confused. Clip 25, please.
when Ubi says, why can't you just write a letter to the Pope and the Pope answers a question? Oh, come on. I mean, that's not how it works.
Okay, so you can see he's gotten confused. I never said anything about people writing letters to the Pope to get an answer. I said the Pope writes letters to bishops to receive consultation so that he can give an answer. If you want the original clip, it's in the show that we did with Swan Sona. I believe it's in the first 20 minutes or so of that show. Again, it appeared that he was drinking during that. So let's go to clip number 26, please.
And you, as a, and let me go ahead and get rid of this. You, as someone, and when I say you, I mean Ubi, who is out there trying to refute Catholics and trying to tell us what Catholics believe by quoting Gasser and Vatican I. If you can't even understand why that's a stupid question, and I'm sorry, it's a stupid question. There's no, I'm not going to filter that. And it's only stupid if you claim to know as much as Ubi claims to know. You're making videos about the Catholic Church. You must know about the Catholic Church. Now, it's not stupid for someone who doesn't know about the Catholic Church, who doesn't make videos out there, who doesn't claim to be this, this, I guess, authority in this topic. So if you don't know the answer to this question, you shouldn't be refuting Catholics, because this is simple stuff. You should know this. If you are trying to refute us, you should know this. So now go back to the drawing board. Here's why we can't just go to the Pope every time there's a question in the church. It's because he doesn't have all the answers. He needs to go seek the answers. And that's a way of having an ecumenical council. That's one way the infallibility of the Pope works. He holds an ecumenical council so he can see what the mind of the church is. Hey, bishops, what do we believe about this? Let's all have a council together. Oh, that's what we believe? Okay. I see what you're saying here. I see that this fits with Scripture. And since you're consenting to this, I'll be consenting to this as well. And so there you have the head and members working together, consenting together. It's not the Pope just seeking the advice of the bishops and then taking that advice and saying, well, thanks for the advice, guys, but I think I'm going to throw everything you're saying here, and by myself, I'm going to decree something alone. That's not possible, because that means he would be the only Orthodox bishop. That's impossible. The Catholic Church doesn't believe that the Pope could ever be the only Orthodox bishop in the world.
And there you see it, the bottle of booze. Looks like a Moretti, perhaps. But you can see, again, he's ranting now about a question that I never asked. It was very clear when you listen to the clip. I never said, why don't we just write letters to the Pope and find out what the infallible answer is? You'll also notice in that clip that he starts to conflate an ecumenical council with papal infallibility, and he does this throughout his series. He merges them together, and in this clip specifically, he seems to be limiting the role of an ecumenical council to an advisory body that then allows the Pope to speak infallibly. But papal infallibility is not the same as an ecumenical council. There are two different levels of the extraordinary magisterium, or two different categories within the extraordinary magisterium. Let's play clip number 27, please.
And then he also says that there's a reason why the Catholic Church has only had one ecumenical council after Vatican I, which was pastoral. So what he's trying to say is, now that we have papal infallibility in the Catholic Church, we no longer need ecumenical councils, because the Pope can just decree something infallible and voila, no more need of it. He's very selective. I mean, how often does the Church usually hold ecumenical councils? I mean, what is he expecting here? I mean, prior to Vatican I, the ecumenical council that was held was in Trent, which was in the early 16th century. What is that, like 350 years later, then we have another ecumenical council? So we don't have them often, right? And you know, Trent and Vatican I both dealt with dogmatic matters, and Vatican II didn't really deal with dogmatic matters. It was pastoral. So it's not because we have papal infallibility that we don't have that we didn't have a dogmatic council. I think Vatican II wasn't dogmatic because it was a council that was trying to bring the Church to the world, right? And so it's not going to put a bunch of anathemas out there. It's supposed to be a friendly council to where it opens the doors to the world and say, hey, we're not that bad. You know, it has nothing to do with papacy. It has nothing to do with papal infallibility. That's not why it wasn't dogmatic.
Okay, so he's ignoring something here. In the list of ecumenical councils that the Catholic Church recognizes within the Catechism, as far as I know, Vatican II is the only instance of a pastoral ecumenical council. Now, one could argue that Trullo was pastoral, but Trullo is not accepted as an ecumenical council by the Catholic Church currently. Although in the past we see popes making statements indicating that it is, the Catholic Church now does not accept it. So what he's leaving out is that the one pastoral ecumenical council that has occurred within the Catholic Church just so happened to occur right after papal infallibility was declared, not even a century after. But in this very excellent book entitled Vatican I, The Council in the Making of the Ultramontane Church by John W. O'Malley, he says there are three reasons why there were no ecumenical councils between Trent and Vatican I. He gives three very good reasons. The first is, quote, after the Council of Trent, the persuasion grew among Catholics that Trent had solved all problems, unquote. The second is, quote, the second reason was the reluctance of the popes to risk what a council might decide, especially regarding themselves and their offices, unquote. The third one, quote, the third and most immediate reason for the gap was the acrid political ecclesiastical situation that began to develop in the middle of the 17th century and culminated in the later decades of the 18th, just before the French Revolution, end quote. So we have three reasons there, okay? But he's leaving out some important information there. Now, let's go to the next slide, please. See, this is not the first time that Yossi has used his imagination in regard to what I've said. So we see he becomes confused about who writes letters to who. Case in point on screen, you can see where he has screenshot a comment I've made under one of our YouTube videos, and then Yossi has mentally inserted his own name into it, when not only is his own name not mentioned, but it's not even hinted at. He then runs to Twitter to rant about me mentioning him when I never mentioned him at all. And it's funny that he accuses me of poor reading comprehension when he's the one reading his own name into it. You can see on screen and read these for yourself. It's semi-unbelievable. And I think this is really a result of just how horrendous the public education system is in California, how far it's fallen. All right, let's go to clip number 28. And while you cue that up, I'll explain this. Now, several times in the video, and we've touched on this earlier, he attempts to actually answer our objections to papal infallibility. Our objection that there's no way to stop a rogue pope from binding the church to heresy. Okay, let's play clip number 28.
It is actually sinful for the pope to decree something without first seeking the mind of the church. And it wouldn't be good on his part to do that, because if he's not sure that the church believes this thing that he's about to decree, if he's not sure, God will impede him. And one way God can impede somebody is by, striking them dead, or changing their mind, or allowing the bishops to talk to the Pope and change his mind. We don't know how. Somehow he'll impede it. We don't know how. But we know that he cannot decree something that is in opposition to the consent of the church, because his job is not to make up new doctrines. His job is to make known the things that have always been taught by the church. And so if they've always been taught, then consent has to be behind them. If they're not behind his teachings, then that means they were never taught. They were never taught. And so that would be a false dogma, and he will be impeded from making it. So as long as he is able to make it, now we know a few things. If he makes it, it has behind it the consent of the church. It has behind it the stamp of God. It has behind it the tradition of the church, that it has always taught this. Very important distinctions. And if you're not a careful thinker, you're going to miss this, and you're going to think, hey, Pope versus bishops, where, who's going to win? And this is what drives me insane with these debates between East and West. The East is trying to emphasize the authority of the bishops. And when I say West, I mean like Catholic apologists. They're trying to emphasize the authority of the Pope. Look, they're both necessary. They both need each other. You can't have one without the other. That's how it works. Head and body always act together, whether it's ecumenical councils or whether it's papal infallibility. The Pope will always act with his brother bishops. He'll always act with his brother bishops. That's what the Vatican I fathers had in mind. And that's why they didn't define what he has to do beforehand.
Okay, so you can see here his best answer to what we're saying is, well, it just won't happen. It goes back to Ubi's half-truth. Well, yeah, that's true, but it's not the whole truth. Elijah's full truth, trust me, bro, won't happen. That's not an answer to what we're saying, that there's no mechanism to stop a rogue or unscrupulous pope. Now, we're going to skip slide number 30, because he says pretty much the same thing. It's from hour 28 to hour 30:15 in this first video. And we're going to go to clip 32, and we're going to play that.
What Ubi Petrus wants you to believe is that the Pope can separate himself from the church, be in complete opposition to the bishops, and speak ex cathedra, and everyone bows down to him. To us, that's an impossible situation. It's equivalent. It's equivalent to an Eastern Orthodox believing that the bishops could all die at the same time. They could be in an ecumenical council together, gather every single one of them, and they get bombed and they all die. That's impossible, because the church would fail. That's it. You're done. You have no more bishops. And so we believe by divine protection, divine providence, that God protects the churches in certain ways. We believe that he protects the this relationship between head and body. They're always going to be together, always going to act as one, as unison, and whether it's ecumenical councils, whether it's papal infallibility, the head and at least part of the body, which now becomes the whole body. If you're not part of it, you're no longer part of it. And so now the whole body just becomes smaller. If there are divisions in the church, it doesn't become two, it becomes smaller. And so the Pope acts with those brother bishops who are Orthodox.
Okay, so first you see him reducing the church down to the Pope unintentionally. That's what that point inadvertently does, that the church is those bishops who agree with the Pope. Okay. Now, we also want to point something out. He makes this point about the impossibility of the Pope going wrong in the same category as all of the bishops being killed. Now, for us, it comes down to a matter of likelihood, right? So the Council of Chalcedon is the best attended council in the history of the church, and the hagiography states 640 bishops attended, while St. Leo and, if I recall correctly, St. Justinian state 520. Father Price, in his translation commentary on the Council of Chalcedon, states that according to the list of signatures at Chalcedon, there were just over 370 bishops and representatives. But let's pretend all those were bishops, all 370 were bishops. Now, during Chalcedon, one of the bishops stood up and stated there were about 1,200 bishops in the empire. Considering that there were additional bishops in the Arab Gulf and Ethiopia, Nubia, out into Persia, up into the British Isles, and some parts beyond the frontier in Germania, I would estimate the number you might want should be up around 1,600. But let's say 1,200 bishops total, and let's say that the hagiography is correct and there were 640 bishops present. That's still only 53% of bishops present in one place at the best attended ecumenical council. With more realistic numbers, taking into consideration that there were probably 1,600 bishops total, that, you know, a number of those 370 bishops that are on the signature list were actually not bishops, they were representatives of bishops. It's closer to about 20% of bishops present at the best attended ecumenical council in church history. So it's more a matter of likelihood and chances of one rogue pope making a heretical decree. That is far, far more likely than the less likely scenario of even half of the Orthodox bishops being gathered in one place at one time. So, all right, now we're going to skip clip number 33, but it takes place from hour 44:07 to hour 48 in his second video. And he reads from Ut Unum Sint, and he tries to show that the Pope must make a decision in communion with the other bishops. But again, Ignasi never shows how that is actually enforced. It's merely a promissory note. And he comments on us making papal infallibility look, quote, worse than it really is. Says lots of stuff like, don't trust Ubi, I've quoted popes, I've quoted theologians, what more do I lack? Well, what he lacks is a method of enforcement. And he gets to this later, where he then inserts in how a method of enforcement could be applicable, but it turns out that the method of enforcement he is insisting on is actually condemned by name in Gasser's Relatio. Now, let's play clip number 34, please.
Eric has a question here. Seeing as the Orthodox are always describing the papacy as an isolated, independent, and exclusive overlord as opposed to conciliary, can you give one example of said doctrine? Can you give us one example of said doctrinal lordship? Now, are you, and to clarify, Eric, are you asking an example to where the Pope did do that? And if that's what you're asking, in fact, I've listened to a lot of Ubi Petrus's videos, not just the ones he makes on his website, but like when he comes on live. I think he has a voice changer where he changes his voice so that you can't recognize who he is. He's admitted that even the second millennium popes have always sought the consent of the bishops before they acted. If I remember that correctly, he said that. He said as much. So it's not so much that they think that he hasn't done this. I think they would agree with us that the popes haven't lorded over. It's this idea, like I go back to this idea of trusting that they won't do it in the future, right? So they want a juridical thing in there that says that he has to first seek the consent of the bishops before he acts, because they don't trust that in the future that they won't act this way. They won't act in a way of they won't act alone, right? And so, yes, I think a lot of the East would agree with us. Those that know what they're talking about. There are all those who are, just not informed on this topic, that think the Pope acts without his brother bishops. But the ones that know, they know that the Pope never does that, right? But it's just this idea of mistrust. They don't trust that he will always be that way. They don't believe that this idea of papal infallibility is even a gift in the first place.
Okay, so what you see here is that on the one hand, he states those Eastern Orthodox who are knowledgeable about these things know that the Pope would never act without consulting his fellow bishops. Okay, then at the same time, he points out that I have supposedly pointed out that the popes have always sought the cooperation of the bishops in decree, even the second millennium. Now, the logical conclusion of that, though, is that therefore I would be knowledgeable about this stuff, which, considering that he regularly disparages my knowledge on the topic, it's rather ironic that he has now inadvertently stated I'm knowledgeable on it. But the fact is that the popes, well, we'll give you this example. Next slide, please. So here we have this quotation from Pius IX. He's the Pope who called the First Vatican Council. He's the one that approved the Relatio. He is papal infallibility incarnate. And he states this, he goes, I am so determined to go forward with this matter, that being papal infallibility, that if I knew the council was going to be silent on it, I would dissolve it and define it myself. This is found in O'Malley's book, Vatican I, page 186. The citation is from Schatz, Father Klaus Schatz, who wrote Papal Primacy, and it's from Vaticanum I. So here we have an example that the Pope, if the bishops were not going to cooperate with him, he would have just simply gotten rid of them, and or he would have dissolved the council and defined it himself. So the bishops were not actually free. I mean, this is straight from the horse's mouth. It's not some random theologian. This is the guy who defined papal infallibility, points out that he was about to abuse that power. So we have very, very, very good reason for being afraid, because in all effect, the Pope has done this in the past. But we can see areas where the popes act unilaterally. For example, the appointment of bishops by the Vatican. Benedict XVI's motu proprio he had to go over the heads of the bishops in order to have the Latin Mass, allowed. You also have Pius X revising the entire Roman Missal by papal fiat. I think he maybe consulted some scholars on it, but, well, of course he consulted some scholars, but I don't think he put this before the bishops. You also have Magisterium Pascali. It redoes the entire Roman calendar. It decanonizes scores of saints. These are times when the Pope, by papal fiat, has stepped in to do something and has basically just ignored the bishops outright. Now, let's go to clip number 1, please.
That's what he's saying. He's so stuck on this idea of Vatican I. His whole idea of it is so off. He's confused, and he's trying to refute Catholicism with his confusion.
Okay, let's go to clip number 3, please.
Ubi Petrus is an Eastern Orthodox, so he doesn't understand Catholic teaching, and so he's not an expert on Catholic teaching. And you could say, well, what makes you an expert on Catholic teaching? Well, as anybody who watched the first 2 episodes, nothing I said was my opinion. Everything I was saying, I was backing up with the Relatio of Gasser. I was backing up with with theologians, with bishops, with popes. I was quoting left and right, right? Whereas Ubi Petrus is mostly just narrating. It's not really his voice, but it's his content. He's narrating what he thinks papal infallibility is, and he's completely off. He gets it wrong.
Okay, so when you factor in that he has inadvertently stated that I'm knowledgeable on the topic, right? And then he's in other clips, you'll hear him say things like, "Well, you know, this video is a nice introduction to papal infallibility and the relatio." Speaking of our video, and then he's consistently ceded our points. One has to wonder how he can suddenly decide that I'm confused or that I'm completely off about it. I mean, if I'm completely off about it, and yet he's ceding our points left and right, wouldn't that mean that he's completely off about it? I mean, I think what he means is that because we're not qualifying it with, yeah, the Pope could abuse his power, but that's just not going to happen because we're not qualifying it with his, caveat. Therefore, we're confused. So if you accept that the Pope can abuse his power, but that it'll just never happen, then apparently you're not confused. So clip number 5.
And what he's saying here is true. And that's the part that I like about this video of his, is he's building this foundation that the document of the Relatio of Bishop Gasser is the official interpretation of papal infallibility. So if you want to know what papal infallibility teaches, Vatican I teaches on that topic, chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus, you go read that document. I've obsessed about this document for like 10 to 15 years. You can ask my wife. I'm like the biggest weirdo when it comes to this topic.
So on the one hand, we're confused, but then we've created this video that's a nice introduction to infallibility in the Relatio. Again, who's confused about what? We're going to skip clips 36 and 37, and we're going to go straight. Actually, no, let's go to number 35.
What he's saying here is, since Pastor Aeternus only put that not from the consent of the church part to defeat Gallicanism, and now that Gallicanism has been defeated, it's been exercised, we no longer have to worry about it. Can we now insert, into the definition of papal infallibility that the Pope, before he decrees, has to go and seek the consent of the church and the other rulers of the church before he acts? In other words, he's asking the question, can we now include that? Since now the desire is no longer to refute Gallicanism, now the desire is communion with other churches. And so if we want to have communion with other churches, it wouldn't be against the definition itself. It wouldn't contradict the definition itself to put a condition in papal infallibility. That would be a form of development, okay? Because now we're dealing with different times. We're dealing with a different situation. No longer Gallicanism. Now we're dealing with bringing people back into the church. Whether it's Eastern Orthodox or Orthodox. We would now have a Pope who has to go seek that. If his definition is the same as far as opinion goes as the church goes, because if it's in agreement with the church, that means it's dogmatic, it's true, it's infallible. Now we can declare it. The church believes it. And so he's saying it's not against the definition itself for us to include in there this juridical rule for the Pope to seek the consent of the church. And because it's no longer about Gallicanism. And so keep that in mind. And I think, in my opinion, if there is ever going to be communion in the church between East and West, you have to, as the Catholics, we have to include in the definition this juridical rule of the Pope seeking the consent of the church before. But you also have to qualify that, and I understand the issues that you would have if that rule is put in the definition. Not the issues as far as contradicting Vatican I. It wouldn't contradict Vatican I because that's what we're trying to say here. The issue would be, like the situation, what happens when the church is split 50-50, or what happens if only 80% consent to the Pope? What happens to 20%? If somebody says, hey, 20% of the bishops didn't agree with this, so it's not infallible anymore. So you have issues like that, and now it becomes more complicated. But I don't see any other way of bringing back communion between the churches. But we also don't want to compromise the truth. We don't want to compromise the truth. So in the sense of positive sense, like Gasser was saying, I think that should be included juridically. But in the negative sense, where there's split between churches, well, now the Pope can't do that. And so you have to kind of distinguish between those two before you go talking about these agreements between East and West. There's a lot of factors that play into it.
Okay, so we're going to skip clips 36 and 37, but he delves into this more, the same point, at 1 hour, 30 minutes, and 34 seconds. And then again at 2 hours, 4 minutes, and 37 seconds, both of those in video too. And he states that he does not think that it would be against the doctrine of papal infallibility were it to be added in that the Pope must seek the manifest consent of the bishops to speak infallibly. The problem, though, is that Gasser actually he actually states that this is against papal infallibility itself. You can see that, therefore, whoever contends that the Pope, either for his information or for an infallible judgment about faith and morals, totally depends on the manifest consent of the bishops or on their aid, has nothing left to do than to establish that false principle which states that all dogmatic judgments of the Roman Pontiff are weak and reformable in and of themselves unless the consent of the Church accrues to them. But such an outlook is either completely arbitrary or subversive of all papal infallibility. Gasser, later referring to that same ideology that Yossi put up, states, this system or outlook is completely subversive of all papal infallibility and the consent of the whole Church. The consent of the whole Church is required by it. He also says, unless we fall again into the infallibility of the pontiff decreeing by himself alone, the Pope would not be able to confirm any but those decrees of a council which were pleasing to a majority of the bishops, or rather to the unanimity of the bishops. That's Gasser and papal infallibility. The solution that you could just, add this in, it would become acceptable to the East. Well, that's against the actual official interpretation of it, Gallicanism or not. So he's wrong there, unfortunately. Now, let's go to clip 39A, please.
Look, this whole idea of Flavian and Eutychus both appealing to the Pope. Now, Eutychus was under the See of Constantinople, and Flavian was the Patriarch of Constantinople. And so Flavian holds a synod in Constantinople where he excommunicates Eutychus for his teaching, for basically saying that Christ has one nature, and his idea of one nature is a heresy, right? So he excommunicates him, and he has the authority to do that. But now Eutychus has the right to appeal to the Pope. But they both appeal to the Pope because now there's two sides here that are attacking each other. And so who makes the decision here? Who makes the decision? Did Pope Leo say, "Oh, I don't have any authority to do this"? No, he goes to these Sardigian canons and says, because of those canons that Leo read to you, I have the authority to decide. And he decides. He writes a tome. It's called the Tome of Leo, where he decides which side was right, and he sides with Flavian of Constantinople, and the whole tome is against Eutychus, right? And so that right there basically is a hammer on Ubi Petrus's interpretation of Sardican. Now it's a question of, hey, who are we going to believe here? And this is something that Eric Ibarra sent me today, so he brought this to my attention, which I appreciate. This Epistle 44, which I think is a huge blow to Ubi's stance here. But who are we going to believe? We're going to believe Pope Leo the Great, who was a saint in our church and also in Eastern Orthodox Church? Or are we going to believe Ubi Petrus? That's the question you want to ask yourself when you're looking at his videos.
Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so this is a letter that he's talking about with this. And you'll notice this part here. It says, and Bishop Flavian gave them, the Roman delegation, an appeal in writing to order a general synod to be held in Italy, which shall either dismiss or appease all disputes in such a way that there be nothing any longer either doubtful in the faith or divided in love. And to it, of course, the bishops of the eastern provinces must come. Then later Leo says, and how necessary this request is after the lodging of an appeals witnessed by the canonical decrees passed at Nicaea by the bishops of the whole world, which are added below. Okay, so Nicene canons occasionally refer to the canons from Sardica because at Rome they had them appended onto Nicaea. Now we're going to leave that up on screen while we read this so that you can refer back to this, okay? So first, Elijah is stating, or at least lining it up, as if the Pope was, or as if the tome was written in response to Flavian's deposition at Ephesus in 449. And that's why he's talking about Flavian appealing, okay? That was when Flavian actually appeals after he was deposed at Ephesus, and that's in letter 44, which is on screen. Now that's flat out wrong. The tome was actually written shortly after the Synod of Constantinople in 448, the synod that deposed Eutyches. What had happened there was Eutyches was condemned and announced that he would appeal his deposition to Rome. And he does this in letter 21 in the Corpus of St. Leo. You can see the letter that Eutyches writes. Now, St. Flavian, knowing that an appeal will be lodged and that Eutyches has corresponded with Leo in the past, Flavian writes letter 22 and attaches it to the proceedings of the council that deposed him, stating, quote, therein we deprive him as convicted on these charges of his priesthood, of the management of his monastery and of our communion, in order that your holiness, also knowing the facts of his case, may make his wickedness manifest to all the God-loving bishops who are under your reverence, lest perchance, if they do not know the views which he holds, all of which he has been openly convicted, they may be found to be in correspondence with him as a fellow believer by letter or by other means. This is Epistle 22, 4 in the Corpus of Leo. It's a letter written to Pope St. Leo by St. Flavian. You can see Flavian is writing to warn Leo about Eutyches because Flavian knows that Eutyches is appealing to Leo. Now, Leo writes back in letter 23 and states that Eutyches has stated in his appeal that he is more than willing to be corrected if he has said anything incorrect. Leo mentions this to Flavian, stating, quote, and no difficulty can arise on this side, since the said presbyter has professed himself by his own statement ready to be corrected if anything be found in him worthy of rebuke. That's in letter 23. That is when Flavian then pens letter 26 in the Corpus of Leo. There are a couple letters between them that are in the Corpus of Leo. They're not between him and Flavian. They're other bishops. That's why it skips from 23 to 26. In letter 26, Flavian asked Leo to write something thereby giving, quote, weight and support to the matter, as Eutyches admits he will listen to Leo. As we just discussed in letter 23, Leo repeats this. Yassi misunderstands letter 26 to be a request for an ex cathedra decree, and Yassi detaches it, probably out of ignorance, from the fact that Eutyches states outright that he is willing to be corrected by Leo. Hence why he appeals to Leo, he appeals to Dioscorus, he appeals to other. And this goes back to the idea of figures possessing clout or prestige, exemplified in the Latin concept of auctoritas, discussed in our debate review. Now, Eutyches was not an unknown figure in Constantinople, though. He wasn't just some no-name guy. He'd become famous in his opposition to Nestorius 2 decades earlier and managed several large monasteries in the capital. He had also corresponded with Leo prior to this, meaning he was someone of some importance. He had a godson who was in the imperial court, which meant that he was a figure of some renown. Now, second, Elijah seems to be misinterpreting the Sardican canons to refer to sorting out doctrinal issues instead of sorting out issues related to appealing clerical depositions. In the hard copy version of the letters of Leo by Schaff, the same edition that is up on New Advent and Elijah is reading from, the footnotes, which are not in the New Advent version, they're only in the hard copy. The footnotes cite other scholars of the time in advocating that Leo is actually referring to Canon 4 of Sardica. Now, I would encourage readers to actually read the Sardican canons, specifically the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 9th canons, as they will see these are not at all related to dogma or calling for dogmatic councils. They're purely about reviewing cases of clerical depositions and deciding if they deserve a retrial. Now, if you go to our first video, Why Catholicism is Wrong on Church History and Eric Ibarra Refuted, start at minute 13 and we read each of these canons and have them on screens. So you can see for yourself the canons that Yassi is claiming deal with some sort of papal, ability to define dogma. No, they're purely about clerical depositions. And even the Catholic sources agree with us, with our interpretation, because in paragraph 19 of the Chieti document, which came out several years ago, it's linked in the video description here. If you go to paragraph 19, the Pope's hand-chosen scholars state outright the Sardican canons are precisely what we are arguing they are. They do not support Yassi's interpretation. But a few things here, just to recap. Eutyches, he appeals to Rome, to Alexandria, to Thessalonica, and to Jerusalem, and he shouts this out at the council. And so Flavian wants to preempt it, and he sends a letter to Leo warning him. That's what's going on. He also sends with that letter proceedings from the council that depose Eutyches. Eutyches states that he's willing to be corrected. Leo goes, okay, I'll write something to correct it. Flavian goes, yeah, sounds great. Please write something lending your weight and support to it. That's how the tome came about, because Eutyches had a following in Constantinople. He was someone of some repute. So something major like that would be needed. And this is also in the aftermath of Ephesus. You have this tentative peace going on starting in 433. It's a tricky time. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. All right, you can see here in letter 43, there's a similar message as letter 44, and you can see that Flavian is asking for a general council to be called to overturn the decisions of Ephesus too. This is really important, okay? He's calling for a general council to be held, and he hands off his appeal to the Roman legates because at the council, all hell breaks loose. And Flavian is beaten. He's beaten so badly that he ends up dying shortly thereafter. And the Roman legates flee the council. In fact, it's the deacon who yells out, annulled, and then he runs out as fast as he can. So, of course, Flavian's going to hand off his appeal to the Roman legates because no one else there was on his side. If he handed it to anyone else, his appeal would just be thrown away. And so the Pope then relays this to the emperor because the emperor is the one that calls an ecumenical council, right? Okay, so when Elijah says things like, who do you trust more, St. Leo or Ubi? We need to rephrase that with, whose interpretation of Leo do you trust more, Elijah's or the scholarly consensus that Ubi is quoting from, okay? Now, further, moments 36-41, Elijah then reads from Epistle 14 of Pope St. Leo and ignores what is written to the papal legates in Thessalonica, which is part of the Roman Patriarchate. He does correctly point out, though, that there is a sort of pyramid of Peters converging towards the highest, but he ignores that each of these levels mirrors the one below in prerogatives, so that it goes Pope, Metropolitan, or Pope, Patriarchs, Metropolitans, Archbishops, and finally Bishops, with each having a mere role over the other. Now, from there, we've seen Catholic apologists argue that if each bishop is Peter and each bishop has immediate and ordinary jurisdiction over the diocese in virtue of being Peter, therefore the Pope has ordinary and immediate jurisdiction over those bishops. That's the argument they make. Now, that analogy, it fails because it would require consistency throughout the model. And it would require that archbishops have immediate and ordinary jurisdiction over their the bishops in their archdiocese, then that metropolitans have immediate and ordinary jurisdiction over the archbishops in their metropolitanate, that then patriarchs have ordinary and universal jurisdiction over the metropolitans in their archdiocese, and then finally the Pope. Well, we know that patriarchs, metropolitans, archbishops don't have that. So their analogy would require us to skip the middle three of the five ranks, you could say. And it's an argument that it just lacks consistency. From there, he goes on to quote from letter 10, which is written to the bishops of Vienna and France, again, within the Roman sphere of influence. It's within their patriarchate, okay? Now, Yassi confuses the difference between papal infallibility and synodality, okay? Next slide, please. Okay. You can see synodality is the Pope and bishops defining dogma together, which is issued in the name of a council. Okay, papal infallibility, the Pope may gather a council, but he defines dogma in his own name. It's not something that is issued forth from the council, it's something that's issued forth from the Pope in papal infallibility, whereas within the synod, it is issued from the synod, which includes the Pope. Okay, next slide, please. Now we have this quotation from St. Peter Chrysologus. He was the Bishop of Ravenna, and Eutyches actually appeals to him. And so Eutyches, St. Peter Chrysologus he writes back to Eutyches, and he adds in that, the Pope is ahead of the synod. I mean, the statement, all it does is it shows that the Pope is ahead of the synod and that they cannot resolve doctrinal disputes without him. Well, that's just synodality. That's all it is. It's fine by us. And the quotation is from 449, meaning that the tome had already been making its way around, and it is more likely than not the Christological limitus testis in the West, or limitus test in the West at this point. So he is most likely referring the need to get on board with that. More than that, I think it's dangerous to assume that far too little scholarship has been done on the writings of St. Peter Chrysologus in terms of his views on the papacy to make a judgment call in terms of what he thought of Rome. For all we know, this might be the only comment he made about Rome, and chances are, as it is a Catholic quote mine, and those tended to comb through absolutely everything with hardcore Peter syndrome. If this is all we can find from St. Peter Chrysologus in terms of papal, that could lend itself to a Catholic reading, this is all he wrote, because they look for everything that they can, and they will dig up stuff that doesn't even indicate it and present it how it does. They're just so desperate for that. So let's go to our next slide here. Okay.
And Leo believes it was.
Well, keep pause up, please. Okay. Now, Yassi attacks our reference to letter 26 of St. Leo, which St. Flavian writes to Leo, asking for support in the cause of Eutyches, and we covered that earlier. But the issue here is Yassi tries to recast papal infallibility as synodality. The problem being that a synod declares something, while in papal infallibility, the synod can be called and discuss a topic, as we showed in the slide. And if you try to conflate those two, what you find is that you just find examples of papal infallibility all over the place, because suddenly a synod is an example of papal infallibility. And what he's doing is something similar to someone saying, well, if you support this or that cause, wear jeans tomorrow. Well, almost everyone already wears jeans, or a sizable portion of the population does. So you can suddenly create support for yourself where there really isn't any whatsoever. And he does that with papal infallibility and ex cathedras. Let's go to clip number 41, please.
And Leo believed it was infallible. And Ubi would say, well, yeah, Leo believed it was infallible, but what bishop writes a letter and doesn't think it has no errors? The ones that appeal to the Pope. The ones that appeal to the Pope. They appeal to him and say, hey, here's my case. You judge me. You tell me, is that infallible or not? You tell me if there's any errors in my case. Those are the ones that would say that. So I think that's a ridiculous argument to make, to say that, Leo believed his letter was infallible, but every bishop or patriarch that writes on the faith, letter about some dogma of the church, he believes that there's no error contained in it. That's not true. That's not true. You have Saint Cyril and Nestorius appealing to the Pope. You have Eutychus and Flavian appealing to the Pope. If they believe that they can write a letter that would be no error, they would have just done that. Like, all right, that's all we need. We don't need to go to appeal to anybody.
This is important here because he brings up, we already handled the deal between the situation between Eutychus and Flavian. But Yossi here brings up St. Cyril and Nestorius, and he ignores the fact that, one, Nestorius did not appeal his writings to Leo. Okay. Two, in the debate between St. Cyril and Nestorius, St. Cyril writes 3 letters to Nestorius, and then he appends the 12 anathemas onto them. None of those did he send to Rome first to check if they were infallible. In fact, he sent all of them to Nestorius, and then after the fact, he had them translated into Latin and sent to Rome to let them know what was going on. So Yossi's argument there about these bishops looking for infallibility from Rome, it falls on its face, because if Yossi's argument is that these bishops were sending their letters to Rome or were having Rome check them first to make sure they were correct, well, that's not what happened in the case of Cyril and Nestorius. What happened was that Cyril acted on his own. In fact, he didn't even ask to attach the 12 anathemas. He just did it on his own. So, all right, now we're going to go to the slide that we have. Next slide, please. Now, in video 3, hour 15, Yossi states he wants to know what is the difference between letter 120 and the letter to the Swiss bishops. And Yossi challenges anyone to show him what the difference is. Well, the difference is Leo states the tome is judged and ratified by the bishops, and the letter to the Swiss bishops states no such thing. In fact, you can see here, Gasser states it must be accepted and held with full submission of faith as soon as one becomes aware of them, speaking of papal ex cathedra decrees. Next slide, please. He also says there's no juridical necessity for him, the Pope, to prepare the definition in any specific way, nor is this definition once proclaimed subject to review or approval by other bishops or the faithful. Okay, next slide, please. Now we see in Epistle 120, chapter 1, that Leo, he says, what has been corroborated by the irrevocable assent of the whole brotherhood was already been laid down through our ministry to show that what had been first formulated by the foremost see of Christendom and then received by the judgment of the whole Christian world has truly proceeded from himself. Okay, so that doesn't sound, it's been received by the judgment of the whole Christian world. Well, that's not what Gasser said is acceptable. Next slide, please. We can also see here, Epistle 120, chapter 4, he states that it has been ratified by the entire synod, ratified by the assent of the entire synod. Well, ratification doesn't mean submission. Ratification means that you make something valid. So, it's the same term that the bishops use when they're asking Leo to ratify the proceedings of Chalcedon. So, not a good look for Yossi's argument there. Let's go to clip 46, please.
Lumen Gentium 25. Among the principal duties of bishops,
Let's play that.
preaching of the gospel occupies an eminent place. For bishops are preachers of the faith who lead new disciples to Christ, and they are authentic teachers, that is, teachers endowed with the authority of Christ, who preach to the people, committed to them the faith they must believe and put into practice, and by the light of the Holy Spirit illustrate that faith. They bring forth from the treasury of revelation new things and old, making it bear fruit and vigilantly warding off any errors that threaten their flock. Bishops, teaching in communion with the Roman pontiff, are to be respected by all as witnesses to divine and Catholic truth. In matters of faith and morals, the bishops speak in the name of Christ, and the faithful are to accept their teaching and adhere to it with a religious assent. This religious submission of mind and will must be shown in a special way to the authentic magisterium of the Roman pontiff. Now, and he says, even when he is not speaking ex cathedra. Ubi Petrus mentions that. in the video, as if like even when the Pope is not speaking ex cathedra, we have to assent to what he's saying. And he says, he kind of makes it sound like it's preposterous. Hello. That is no different than when your local bishop is not speaking ex cathedra, since you guys don't even believe in that, right? As Eastern Orthodox, you have to assent your mind and will to what he's giving you instructions on, what he's teaching you. You're not above him. Your local bishop, your patriarch. In fact, that's what it just says here. Bishops teaching in communion with the Roman Pontiff are to be respected by all as witnesses to divine Catholic truth. In matters of faith and morals, the bishops speak in the name of Christ, and the faithful are to accept their teaching and adhere to it with a religious assent. It says that about the bishops and not just the Pope, because that's how it's supposed to work. This whole purpose of that sentence is to say the bishops and the Pope have authority over the people. Duh. That's what you would disagree with that as an Eastern Orthodox? That's ridiculous. You're just taking something out of context and making it sound like it's something else, right? It just means the popes and the bishops have authority over the lay people. And so we have to have religious submission to their authority. That's how Christ set it up.
Okay, so he states that bishops in the Orthodox Church have to be obeyed even when not speaking ex cathedra, and that's parallel to the papal system of the Pope. Even when he's not speaking ex cathedra, he must be obeyed. The problem is that our bishops are responsible to a synod that can depose them if they misbehave, while the Pope cannot. In fact, many years ago, the Bishop of Alaska, Nikolai, was actually deposed by a vote from his clergy. 50-1 voted to depose him because he was, just the guy was a jerk. And the synod went, okay, great, and they deposed him. So it's an apples and oranges situation. Now we're going to skip this other quotation, or this other clip here. It's from video 1, and it's hour 36:12 to hour 38:20, and he attacks our view that if a council is called, it therefore disproves papal infallibility. But we handled that earlier, pointing out that if a council issues something in its name, it's not a case of papal infallibility. What we would need to see is a situation in which a pope calls a council and then the pope on his own, not referencing the council, decrees something. And so far he has not provided examples of that. Now there are many more clips, and we've tried to keep this fairly short, but we're going to play this one fairly humorous clip. It's clip 48, in which a caller, after Yossi talks about how things are supposed to work and how great it is, he has to warn this caller about going to different Catholic churches. Play that, please.
I'll probably check out a Catholic church this weekend. We'll see. Mango, I'm not really sure what you are as far as your faith goes. All I know is I think you're seeking, and I would just to give you some advice. And this is the frustrating part as Catholics today. I think, and obviously this is a show where I'm promoting Catholicism because I'm Catholic, and I want to make sure everyone who is Catholic stays in the church. But if you are outside of the church, my videos can still be beneficial to you. I say that because I want you to be Catholic, right? I believe the Catholic Church is the one true church. Now, what the frustrating thing about the Catholic Church today and us as Catholics is, it's almost like all the modernisms that happen in the local churches makes it very difficult for people like for us Catholics today, right?
Okay, so this is rich humor here. After talking about how the Pope is this great guarantor, he then has to basically point out that Catholic churches are semi-dangerous places to be. The irony there, I don't think that can be missed by by anyone but the dullest. Now, we want to thank you for tuning in, but as we close out, we want to play a couple of clips to end this on.
I'm just giving you this idea that I've read that document, the Relatio, probably more times than I've watched The Office, which is probably hundreds of times per episode. So, just trying to tell you guys that this is something that I've obsessed about. I've read books on, and so I'm not coming from a place of I just watched this video and then now I'm trying to refute it, right?
One, Yossi states that he's read the Relatio more times than he's watched each episode of The Office, which he states is probably hundreds of times. Now, most likely it's probably only like 10 times, But even then, you have to think about what could you have been doing during that time. I mean, you could be, doing, daily prayers. You could be reading the New Testament. You could be reading the Old Testament. You could be reading Church Fathers. You could be reading devotional literature. You could, lots of things, right? As opposed to watching stuff that's just pop culture garbage. Shows that really glorify a type of lifestyle that is in complete opposition to Christian values. Why would one open themselves up to that and then moreover brag about it? But on top of it, what really struck me is in the second clip we're about to play.
We share our love for The Office, so
yeah,
that's
right.
a good show.
Office, hands down.
Yeah,
probably one of my favorite of all time is
for sure.
Because that's one of those I literally laugh at every episode. And I'll tell you this: whenever I watch TV, movies, shows, whatever, I don't laugh. I don't react. I don't understand people who laugh. It's just odd to me. I don't have any kind of reaction. Any reaction I would have is mental. It's never external. But with The Office, I actually laugh during episodes, and that's hard to do. So that shows you how funny it is.
Even if you watch it like 100 times, you still laugh. It still hits you. It's hilarious.
Yeah, I've watched it through over and over because what I do, I like reading and I like studying, but I can't just do that only. I have to have something going. So I might have a lecture going, or I might have a video or something like going, but I can't just do one thing. That's very, very hard for me to just do one thing. I have to do multiple things. So what I tend to do is watch The Office whenever I'm doing something else, like reading. Yeah. And so I've probably watched through The Office every episode at least 7 times.
Oh,
I have most of it. As you already know, I have most of it memorized. So.
Yeah, we always quote it to each other. What we could do, I think it'll be fun if you bring a guest on and he says something stupid. You should just look at the camera like Jim does.
Right.
From now on.
That would be great. Or I can do the same thing with Star Trek. I mean, there was a point where your TNG shows, the Next Generation, your Voyager, and your Deep Space Nine, I could practically quote, and that's a lot. I mean, each one of those is practically, I think, 7 seasons each. That's a lot of episodes. And I could pretty much tell you what they were going to say next. I've watched them so many times because, like I said, I can't just work. I can't just read. I have to do something else in the background. So I'm a nerd.
Intellectual minds, you have to have some weird things going on too.
Right now I'm going through SG1, so I'll sit in my armchair, I'll have my laptop while I'm doing my research, and I have SG1 going, Stargate, which I've already watched through all of SG1, all of Atlantis, but I'm going back through SG1. You ever seen Stargate SG1?
No,
man,
I have not.
The first few.
Lofton goes on about how while he's preparing scripts for videos, he watches TV. So while he's preparing lectures about, theology and lecturing us all about the Magisterium and this problem and that, he's watching The Office. He's watching various other Netflix shows. Now, whether or not these shows are funny is irrelevant to whether or not they're appropriate for our consumption, whether or not they're good for us. And I would encourage all of you to quite literally kill your TV and spend as much time as you can reading devotional literature, reading Church Fathers, because those are the things that will help you, whereas watching The Office, it's just going to make an unchristian lifestyle look acceptable to you over time simply through repetition. So with that, we want to thank you for tuning in, and to our patrons, thank you so much for all of your support. You guys are excellent, and we look forward to the Essence Energy script, which should be out in January. Thank you. Bye.